Hello and welcome to our Canon Young People Programme Creative Storytelling Workshop. I'm Adam Pensotti and I have the pleasure and the privilege to run our Canon Young People Programme across Europe, Middle East and Africa. The purpose of the programme, I want to give you a brief introduction, is to enable disadvantaged young people to have a voice to create a better and more sustainable future for all of us. Working with our local charity partners in each country, we introduce the young people to the power of positive visual storytelling. With a solid base of the 2030 UN SDGs, a goal for everybody. We encourage these young people to creatively express themselves about the issues that are important to them. Should we start the presentation, Laura?
Absolutely. Thank you, Adam, for the introduction. And I just want to start by saying I'm absolutely delighted to be here representing Canon, but also speaking about my passion, photography. I'm just going to share my screen. 1 second.
I'm going to take you through, thanks Laura, I'm going to take you through just a few quick introductions about the Young People Programme, a few more. The programme's been running for 5 years. We've had over 4,500 people on it, and it runs in 18 countries across EMEA. The beauty of the programme is that we work with different charity partners in each country. Over the next 10 years, we want to bring the programme to more people and make them part of our solution to all the challenges that we face. We have 3 key priorities: inspiration, education, and empowerment. But I'm going to hand it over to Laura. Laura is absolutely world-class in her imagery, beautiful, extraordinary imagery, and will be running the whole of this storytelling workshop. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Adam. So as Adam said, I'm going to be running this workshop today. The idea of it is to introduce you to me, my work, a little bit about the Canon program, but mostly it's here for you to give you some tips and tricks about powerful storytelling and how to achieve that in your imagery. So basically, this is kind of the run through of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to start with giving you an intro about me, my story with photography, how I began and engaged with picture taking. Next, we're going to look at telling stories with photographs. You know, we're in a world now where we're saturated with imagery. There's an average of 1.4 trillion images that are taken on an annual basis. So how do you express yourself visually in a way that is still captivating, evocative, but also one that really resonates with people and maybe has the power to change things and change situations, have impact. We're going to talk quickly about the 5 key ingredients of visual storytelling: light, emotion, form, point of view, and narrative. And you know, we're going to talk a little bit about inspirations at the end. Where do you find inspiration to tell powerful and engaging stories? So this is me. I'm Laura El Tantawi. I am a British Egyptian photographer. I have an identity as a British by virtue of being born in the UK, and I'm born to Egyptian parents. So I also have a very strong connection with Egypt. And in fact, I'm giving you this presentation now from Cairo, Egypt, which is, you know, my home. I began taking pictures by surprise. You know, I was studying for a degree in journalism and political science, and I decided to take one photography class just, you know, by way of curiosity. I wanted to see what the world looks like through cameras and maybe get some easy credits towards my degree. And I absolutely fell in love with photography, with the way that you can navigate the world through the camera, understand the world better, understand yourself better as a person, and also tell stories with it, powerful stories. Um, my work focuses on social and environmental issues. There's a marriage in my work between those 2 main themes. I'm really interested in what makes us human today. You know, given that we're in a world where people are facing severe climate challenges, we're in a world where borders are constantly shifting with a huge number of refugees being, you know, moved from their home because of war or again climate or anything, and the borders are constantly shifting, and understanding who we are as people, it's constantly changing, and this is something that really interests me. I've self-published 5 books, and I'm very proud of my identity as a visual creative and as somebody that is part of the Canon brand, and part of a brand that helps me do what I do as a photographer. So basically, let's begin of why we're here today. I've kind of set myself this sort of, I think it's a small goal actually, a goal that I would really hope that after today's talk, that at least half of you will go out feeling inspired and empowered to tell your own stories. So for me, if you walk out of our talk today feeling like somehow something has shifted in you, that now you really feel like you want to tell powerful stories, you know how to take better pictures, then I would be a very happy person. So let's hope that we can achieve that together today. And let's hope that I can inspire you to do that. And the reason this is really important is because you, as a young generation, are very important because you are the future. You know, the issues that we're facing right now, particularly in terms of climate and, you know, like I mentioned before, this shifting borders and, you know, the political changes and everything. These are things that you are going to be confronted with in the future. So how do you navigate that world, and how do you manage to express yourself and tell your own stories within that climate? Your story definitely matters. And every one of you today, everyone in the audience has a story to tell. I mean, this is the beginning of my approach to photography. It's not so much about showing what I'm seeing in the world, it's about showing the world through my own experience, my own story. So every single one of you has a story to tell. So hopefully I'll be able to give you some tools today to express that. And why do we think, you know, why do we think that you are important? It's because as a young generation, you know, I have 6 nephews and nieces between my 2 sisters. I'm the youngest of 3 girls, and both my sisters each has 3 children. And I see, you know, with their kids, they're so occupied with the world today, and they're mostly navigating the world today through the prism of their phones. And we all think that we know them, and we think what interests them and the issues that they're interested in. But in reality, we don't really know so much about the young generation. And I think you can. I think you know who you are. And that's why, again, we need to see the world through your own perspective and through your own experience. You know, there's been so much research done on teenagers and, you know, about addiction to devices and phones and gaming and Snapchat, TikTok. The world has changed in a very dramatic way for your generation. So it's really important that you show us what the world looks like for you. And again, I've touched a little bit on this. Everyone has a story to tell. You know, there's been some research done that in 2020 there was an average of 1.4 trillion photographs that were taken that year. And, you know, the majority of those pictures were captured on phones and on those smartphone devices. So that tool that you navigate the world with is a very powerful tool of telling stories, or at least beginning to tell stories. And it's the tool that people are really engaging with all the time. And of course, like I said, the future is yours. You know, climate change, all these issues of poverty, innovation, technology, space exploration, that's the future we're looking out to. So again, the future is in your hands. So show us what the future looks like for you. Now, why Canon? So basically, as a lot of you might know, you know, Canon is a brand. It basically manufactures lens-based devices, you know, from cameras, but also equipment used in companies and large scale. Of course, my interaction with Canon is more through the camera. And there's some interesting things about Canon. You know, there's this philosophy of Kiyose, which is a Japanese philosophy of people living and working together for the common good, you know, for the people and the planet. Education is a very important value within the philosophy of Kiyose. And this is kind of like why I'm here. I'm here as a photographer, but also through my voice to share with you my experience with visual storytelling. And of course, there's community, you know, empowering a new generation of storytellers to develop their visual skills and give them confidence to tell their own stories, you know, through developing the tool of the camera and constantly changing the technology and making it better equipped to tell these stories, and even giving more ideas. I find a lot of times that with that improved technology, it's actually giving me more ideas to do stories that maybe I wouldn't have thought of before in terms of video, audio, still images, you know, you could tell so much layered stories. And this is all about powerful storytelling and bringing the issue closer and making it resonate more with your audience. And then imaging for good, you know, the power of images and how images and video can change people's lives. These are all things that, you know, that are part of the philosophy. Now, who am I? So, you know, I've talked about visuals and a little bit about my intro and how I began taking pictures. And the first, you know, I began my work as a newspaper photographer in the US in 2002. And in 2005, I returned back to Egypt to basically establish myself as a photographer here. And it coincided with a really critical moment in my personal family because my maternal grandmother had unexpectedly passed away. And she was kind of that voice that was always calling me to come back home. She would say, Laura, we really miss you. Come back home. This is your home. Come back here. So her sudden death is one that I felt quite guilty about at the time. And I felt like I really need to go back and honor her by being back home and, you know, being with my family. And upon my return, you know, I came back to a country that was changing, a country where the landscape was shifting, you know, socially people were fighting for a better quality of life, a better education for their kids, you know, values like democracy and, you know, human rights and all of these kind of basic values that establish their identity at home. So I came back to that, and the camera was a way for me to navigate the streets, to understand who I was after living far away from Egypt for, you know, for about 10 years. I came back as a changed person, a person that has a foot in the West, but also a foot here in, I suppose, the East. Somebody that had a bit of two cultures that are often conflicting. Again, the West with all its values of individualism and, you know, liberty and freedom, and then coming back home to values of family and, you know, and just being part of the community and all of that. So the camera for me was my way to navigate that. And the camera really empowered me to tell my own story because it gave me an excuse to go out on the streets. You know, I started to go out on the streets to neighborhoods I didn't know. I began to talk to people and ask them questions. And, you know, something that I find, and you will probably find that when you begin telling your own stories, when you carry a camera, people are always very curious about your identity. And it kind of, you know, the camera is attached a little bit to the identity of a tourist. So people often think if you're carrying a camera and taking a picture in what is their local neighborhood, they think, oh, that person must not be from here. They must be a foreigner. So that kind of starts a conversation. So for me, it was such a great way for me to navigate my own country, understand my sense of self, and really ask a lot of provocative questions of me. How Egyptian am I since I've lived far away from here for about 10 years? You know, what is Egypt through my perspective? And who am I here? So it was a lot about identity. I'm seeing some questions are being put, and I forgot to say early on that if you have any questions, and I would really, really love to answer your questions at the end of today's workshop. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end. So please continue to post your questions in the chat area in the Q&A, and I'll definitely get to them at the end. So definitely feel free to ask me anything you want to ask, and I'll answer it as best as I can. And after my series In the Shadow of the Pyramids, which I worked on for nearly 10 years, I worked on it from 2005 up until 2014 when I saw the country changing and shifting, and my own identity was changing as well. And by the end of that series, I just came to this shocking realization for me where I felt like I'm a little bit confused about my identity. I'm a bit confused about home. What does home really mean? And the fact that I'm so rooted to Egypt by virtue of my heritage, you know, the traditions and the way I was brought up, does that mean that I have to be here? Does this have to be my home? Or can home be something else? So I began working on the series called Beyond Here's Nothing, which really for me was a way where I was using the imagery as a way to meditate through a cocktail of really confusing emotions, a lot of personal anxieties, a lot of uncertainty about, where I would settle in the world. What does that even mean? Do I have to settle somewhere? And the imagery became a way for me to navigate all these things. It's a very different body of work visually from In the Shadow of the Pyramids. But actually, I think of all my works as different chapters. In the Shadow of the Pyramids happened to be the first one, but Beyond Here's Nothing is the second chapter. So for me, this is about personal storytelling in the sense that with each series, I was growing as a person in my own personal journey, in the world. And the work was always parallel to that. The imagery I was taking was parallel to that. And it was really helping me understand the world better and understand myself better. So, in that sense, I feel that the identity of the photographer and the photographer is very, the two really overlap and they're one and the same. These images were images that I also took. They're quite contemplative, unlike the work in Egypt where I was responding to events or what was happening on the streets. With this series, it was a lot more introspective, really trying to create images when I felt moments of internal confusion, perhaps, or internal sense of anxiety, or all of these things that sometimes happen inside us and we can't really talk about them. A sense of loneliness as well. I think, again, in the world that we're in today, it's so busy. And if you live in a big city, but even sometimes within your own family and network of friends, you just feel like you're not, you feel this sense of solitude. And this is exactly what I felt at the time. And I was trying to reflect on these moments and create something visual that would help me meditate through these feelings. And then for the past few years, since 2008, I've been working on another extensive body of work called I'll Die For You. I'll Die For You is a series that, again, I came across because I'd been to India on one trip. I'd always been so curious about India. Culturally, we have an intertwined history somehow because we're both colonized. And I just wanted to kind of see India. And I had seen so many pictures of India, and I just felt I really want to go there. So I went, and then when I came back a few weeks later, I read an article that there was this huge epidemic of farmer suicides in India. And I couldn't quite comprehend it because the India that I had encountered is one where people worked really, really hard to survive in order to avert death. People worked extremely hard every single day to put food on the table because they didn't want to die or face death. So for me, the idea that people were taking their own lives is something that really shocked me and touched me a lot. And also, my own grandfather was a farmer in Egypt's Nile Delta. So it even touched me on a deeper level because he died about a year before I was born. And my father always tells me that I resemble him a lot. So I was always very curious about this man that I never met that I somehow resemble. And I'm not even sure how I resemble him. So for me, this series became a way to build a picture of my own grandfather, to wonder if he would have taken his own life had he been faced by the kind of challenges that the farmers are facing in the world today. So, to give you more of an idea, this is a story that's really about the connection of man and land and these erratic weather patterns that we're seeing around the world and how it's impacting people in their daily lives. So, what's happening is that in this community of farmers, mostly cotton farmers, they're taking out loans or borrowing money from rich villagers in their community, and they're putting that money investing in irrigation systems or fertilizer or seeds and things to nourish their land. And if they don't get enough rain, or they get too much rain, or the light isn't good enough, or they can't, or anything happens, then the seeds don't produce, and then they can't repay the loan. And season after season, there starts to be an accumulation of these loans, and suddenly they're left with, this burden of having to repay this money, and they feel completely stuck. And what I've discovered in doing this series, and I've traveled, across so many different countries to do this. It started in India, but I photographed in Nepal, in Ireland, in Egypt, in my own grandfather's village. And next year, or actually this year, hopefully, if I can travel, I'll be going to the United States to look at the challenges that farmers are facing and how it's really pushing them to these extremes. So this is a series that's really important for me. It's a series that has really challenged me in the sense, as a photographer, in the sense of how do I tell such a powerful story, a story where every time I go to talk to people, I open up their wounds again when they're talking to me about their relatives who were killed themselves, and all the challenges and poverty and all the challenges they're facing on a daily basis. How do I tell a story in this way, a complicated story in this way that resonates with people, but also has impact, that something can change for them? And then another layer of this story was, again, looking at nature in general. It really opened the door for me to look at nature in a way that I hadn't quite explored before as a photographer. And naturally, for me, it took me to the River Nile in Egypt. It's a Nile that obviously has been a very big part of our civilization here in Egypt, all the way from the pharaohs and our great ancestors. And obviously, with farming, it's been a critical way where farmers rely on it to feed the land and keep it nurtured. So I started to look at the river and really look at a way that evokes the feeling of the river. I'm really interested in a photographer in feelings, how you can evoke a feeling in an image. And what really excites me about photography is when an audience responds to an image. And I find a lot of times that people will see things about my images and bring their own meanings, their own history to an image, and things that I didn't quite contemplate. But it's something that I find really, really exciting about photography as well. So I'm going to show you a quick 2-minute video. And just to tell you about video, for me, I feel, and I'm definitely believe that photography is a progressive medium. When photography was invented in the 1800s in France or England, there's a bit of a contest about that. But whatever it is, photography has definitely progressed. And I believe that with the technology and the tool of the camera, it really enables us to embrace that progression in a way that allows us to tell better stories. So for me, video and audio has become a very, very important layer in telling stories. For me, to bring the sound of a place to an audience is something that for me is a very powerful experience. But also to show people as they move and to show their body language is something that I think is also very important in powerful storytelling. So I'll just show you the video. This is basically some of the images from an immortal river. So I really focused on showing the details of the surface of the water. It's quite impressionistic and abstract, but what I was really looking for was, again, evoking that feeling of the river. We all know what a river looks like. So for me, it was about a much deeper thing, thinking about my history, my deep connection to the river, how we're all really connected to it as Egyptians and people across, Africa. The River Nile is the longest Nile in the world. It goes through 11 countries in Africa. And we're also a continent that's really threatened with water shortages in the future. So what does this say about our connection to the River Nile? It's a Nile that's also polluted, but it's a Nile that has so many stories about war, about so many things, bodies being put in the Nile. So I feel like it's a Nile that is a river that is so rich with stories. So all of these emotions were things that I was really trying to evoke in the work. And this is basically Right, so that was An Immortal River, and as you read at the end, the song is a very famous song by an Egyptian musician called Muhammad Abdul Wahab. If there's any Egyptians or Arabs in the audience, I'm sure you'll know what I'm talking about. But he's basically an icon for Egyptian music and an icon in the Middle East. And this song is basically a lullaby or a poem written for the River Nile, and it's a song that still lives on today, even though it was created years ago. And the title for the series is inspired from the title of the song. I basically love the song, so this for me is a little bit of a tribute for it. And now I'm basically going to talk about you a little bit more, a little bit about me, but mostly also about you. So here's an important question that I think is worth asking. Why is it so important to tell stories, and why is it even more important to tell stories in pictures? What value is there? So here's what I can tell you after 18 years working as a photographer. This is what I've learned, and this is what really empowers me to tell stories. It's about a sense of community. The camera really becomes a way for you to navigate your community, and community can be as big or as small as you want it to be. This is a very loose interpretation of community. Community can be your family, your immediate family. It could be your neighborhood. It could be your city. It could be whatever religious practice, so your religious community. It could be where you study. So community is something that you decide what your community is, and the camera, the pictures become a way for you to navigate that community, ask questions about it, and put an image on it and really become part of that community as well. It's about communications. I find that, telling stories in visuals is a really powerful way of exploring and relaying stories. People respond to visuals. By our nature, we respond to colors, we respond to visual things. And we're also in a world where, unfortunately, a lot of people just don't have the time to read in the way that we did. We're so used to digesting information through our phones or very quickly now that visuals become a way that you kind of see it, or you can read a caption, so you can communicate a story in a quick way, in a digestible way, but in also a very, very powerful and influential way. Self-expression, and this is also what really excites me about photography, is that in any situation, if you have more than one photographer photographing the exact same thing, I guarantee you that none of the pictures will look the same. This is because we bring our own history into the photographs that we take. So when you take a picture, you're not just taking what you're looking at, you're arriving at it with your history, with your education, with who you are as a person, and you're making very critical decisions about how you're going to photograph that situation. So we don't look at things from a position of neutrality. We're all biased, we all have opinions, and we all have points of view that come across in our imagery. And it also becomes a way to artistically articulate that. So for me, this is also very interesting and powerful. And here's where I really want to involve you in the conversation, in the presentation, and what we're doing here today. Sorry. We have a polling question that my colleague Adam, who you saw in the beginning, is going to be sending out to you. And I'd really love to hear your responses. And I think we're going to tally the responses at the end of the talk. If I'm incorrect, Adam, please feel free to step in and correct me.
Hi, Laura. Yeah, no, absolutely. Your timekeeping is excellent. So yeah, no, we're going to be taking the questions and hopefully helping you with the answers. Do carry on, Laura. We've got quite a lot of questions building up, which I would like to ask you in the last perhaps 5 or 10 minutes of the hour.
Okay, lovely. So I'll just move on and we'll get to your answers at the end. So basically, just to let me know, what do you think is the most important element of visual storytelling? And basically, this is based on like, is it the story? Is it, you know, the community? So everything that we've talked about today, just tell me from your point of view what you think is most important, what stands out to you. And here's why I think it's really important to be talking about visual communication today, because we're in a world, we're in a moment in history where an average of 1.8 trillion photographs are taken each year. You know, it's a very difficult number for me to even comprehend. I usually try to just close my eyes and understand how many zeros are behind that and what does that actually look like. So that's an average of a picture taken every 2 minutes. So we're saturated with imagery, and yet we still, and there's 80% of people that basically believe that they take good images. So it could be discouraging, but actually for me, I see this as something that validates our role as storytellers. Because here's what you can bring to a story. We tell stories that we really care about. You know, this is basically your identity as a photographer is built around that. You know, you could start to contemplate issues and stories that are really important to you by shining a light on them, and you can begin to photograph them. It's about your visual language, you know, how you see the world. If you look at different styles of photography, and by styles I mean the kind of like the signature that different photographers have in their work, this is what I mean by visual language and style. So how do you see the world? Do you see the world in black and white? Do you see it in color? Do you see the world in a rectangle frame? Do you see it in a vertical frame? Do you see it as a square frame? I'm really, you know, those are all things that show us how you see the world through your perspective. And then there's something that I like to term the 3-word rule. So with any picture that you take, or if we're talking about a longer narrative, which means a series of photographs on the same issue, what do you want your audience to take away from it? So when I showed you earlier my work from Egypt, my 3 words, or the words that I really wanted an audience to take away from it, is that it's a work about identity, it's a work about home, it's a work about a sense of community, but it's also a work about chaos, a sense of confusion. So these are things that I would hope that when people look at the images, they can take it away from them. You know, by the same token, my work in India, I'll Die for You, which I showed you about the farmers and the land, I was really hoping that when people look at the work, they see something about, you know, a sense of humanity, a sense of dignity, but also a sense that something is a bit off, and that there's a sense of looming of something that is happening, a tension of some sort. So these are all things that you can allude to in your work through the visual language you're choosing, the editing, and the kind of ways that you're choosing to photograph the issue. Now, kind of taking it to basics, like if we're talking about certain keys, things for you to consider as you move forward into making better pictures, whether it's just pictures of your family, your pet, or bigger issues that you're inspired to tell about your community, or something positive that's happening in your community, or something maybe a really important issue or a person that you're really curious about and you see all the time and you wonder what is the story behind him or her. That these are the kind of things that I'd like you to keep in mind. Light, you know, photography, the word photo, it's, you know, light, it's about how light reacts and comes into the lens or the camera, and how you basically manage that through your shutter speed and your f-stops on the camera. So these are all kind of ways that you can manage the light, and light is absolutely key in photography. You know, it begins with photography, and then all it begins with light, and then all the other elements that we have are other aspects that together create what I would describe as a good photograph. And then there's emotion. Emotion is something that can be quite vague in photography, because you have emotion that is quite clear on the surface, like somebody crying or somebody laughing. That's a way of showing emotion, but you can also show emotion by taking a picture of somebody just showing their back, or just taking a picture of somebody's hands, or taking a picture of somebody while they're while their hands are on their face. And so you're not really sure, are they happy, are they sad, are they crying? Emotion is also something you can create with the use of light, how you compose the image. There's a different emotion to a black and white photograph than there is to a color photograph. So these are all different ways that you can address emotion in imagery and in photography. Form is basically composition. How do you place the different elements through the frame of your viewfinder? And when I say viewfinder, I'm meaning when you look through your camera this way, what are you seeing through that rectangle that you're looking at? And basically composition is how you place all of these different elements in front of you. And then there's point of view. Point of view, like I said, we arrive at images with a story behind us, our own history behind us. So this shapes your point of view. And I definitely believe that we all have biased points of view one way or another. We agree with certain things, we disagree with others, and all of this comes into our perspective as photographers and in the kind of stories that we choose to photograph and how we choose to photograph them. And then there's narrative, which is basically the sequence of images. It could be 3 images, 5, 10, but it's basically a sequence of images on the same theme or issue. So how do you make light work for you? Let's say you're out on a walk in a park, you're looking around you and you want to take a picture that shows good light. Well, the first tip I would give you is to start to observe light. And I'm particularly fond of low light. So what I mean by that is a lot of times you see these really beautiful pockets of light where there's bits of darkness or things that are not really very well lit, but then there's another bit that has a shaft of light on it somehow. This really interests me. So find the kind of light that interests you. Begin to observe light, how it's falling on a tree, how it's making the leaves on a tree look. How does light look on a path that you're walking on? When does it start to get darker? So begin to develop the sensitivity to light and observing how light works. And then it's just a matter of how do you then capture it? How do you handle it when you're taking the photograph? Shooting into bright sunlight is always quite problematic because it kind of creates this brightness and everything becomes haloed in this whiteness. So it's quite difficult to manage, but you could also create some really interesting effects with that. We have this what's called the sunburst effect, which creates this kind of halo or a little bit of a rainbow, which I'm sure you've seen sometimes if you've shown whether it's your phone or your camera directly at the sun, you see a little bit of a rainbow effect. It could be interesting. Maybe you want to use that somehow to photograph something, a portrait of somebody. Silhouettes, I think, are very interesting. Again, when you talk about emotion, we can think immediately about what an emotion looks like, but what does an emotion actually feel like? What does it feel like to be happy, like inside, if you really interrogate what that feeling looks like inside? Is happy red or is happy pink? Is happy a yellow color for you, or is it a green color or a blue color? We all relate to the world in very different ways. So begin to really understand what these emotions look like for you. Find the color that articulates it for you and photograph it. Silhouettes is where you see basically the dark figures against the sun. Again, it's a very interesting way of showing emotion. You don't show faces, but you just show shapes and figures. So it becomes quite an interesting and dramatic way sometimes. Shadows, again, how do shadows fall? I have some visual references to this coming up. I'm just kind of walking you through it quickly. Silhouettes, again, we've discussed it. You look at the dark figures and the shapes of them, but you don't really make any eye contact, or see anybody. So it becomes more of a geometric composition. Shadows and reflections, again, I'm a bit obsessed with reflections personally. I'm always looking at deeper layers and building layers through looking at what happens when you look inside a mirror. What kind of visual complexity does that do when you see something repeated and looking back at you again? Looking at a window, you're seeing through the window, but you're also seeing things reflected in the window. So it creates this multi-dimensional layer of complexity. So here's a bit of, shadows. The picture in blue on the left is one, it's a portrait of my parents. I photograph my parents all the time, and I always photograph them in a way that's quite indirect and not so confrontational in the sense that I show them. So I'm always photographing my parents in different ways. I photograph them in silhouettes and in different ways. So we're getting the answers now. Sorry, I'm just seeing that on my screen.
So that's just the questions going up. There was a slight technical delay, my fault, for launching the questions, but they're now going up as we go.
Well, that's wonderful. It's really exciting to see audience interaction this way. I'm telling you, in the age of non-personal face-to-face interaction, this has become something I really hold on to, because now I kind of feel like I have a sense of you. I'm sensing your presence. So thank you so much for interacting and for taking part in this. I'm just going to minimize it as I continue. Silhouette, again, the picture on the top right, you're just looking at a bit of light. There was a bit of smoke there, and I just managed the light. This particular picture I took on my phone, so you could also adjust your settings on your phone in a way to take that. The other pictures I took on my camera. So with each tool, you can adjust it and learn to work with it in a way that allows you to achieve what you want. Sorry, I just jumped. So again, in terms of light, there's a different quality of light that you get by day. Even by day, there's harsh sunlight, there's like more tender and softer light that you start to get towards sunset, and a different quality of light that you get at sunrise. Rainy days give you another quality of light, and it's quite beautiful. With rainy days, I would just suggest that you really be careful with your tool. The camera, make sure it's protected. You can also photograph from behind the window or from under an umbrella to be able to capture the mood without damaging your equipment or kind of risking it in any way. So there's always interesting ways of capturing the image. And nighttime as well, I'm really interested in looking at pictures at night, and I photograph a lot at night. In fact, the work you saw from Egypt in the shadow of the pyramids, I would say 70% of it was photographed at night. It's just a time of day that I find really exciting, but also Egypt is a place where Cairo in particular is a city that stays awake and it's always alive day and night. So even at night, it's thriving and there's stories and things to show. Golden and blue hour, a lot of you might know this, but some of you may not. When we refer in photography to golden hour, we're referring to the time of sunset, when the light becomes this sort of crimson, I think, light. It's a bit orangey, but really beautiful quality of color. So that's why we call it the golden hour. And it's kind of like the best time of the day to go out and make pictures, because you have this natural, beautiful light. And the blue hour is during dawn, basically. Again, it's really beautiful light. It's quite soft and it can be quite dramatic. And here are some pictures that illustrate that. Again, the picture on the top left is one that I took at nighttime from behind the window. So you're seeing a little bit of the texture of the window, the surface I'm looking at. And in front of that, you're looking at a railing for a balcony and some light from the streets. I'm really interested, like I told you, in really looking at the complexity of imagery and how, without going too far or without leaving where I am, I can try to challenge myself and to create images that feel somehow visually appealing and interesting to me, but hopefully to an audience as well. And they can express some kind of an emotion. Rainy days, this is an image that I took in London. I live between Cairo and London. In London, if you know, we basically have 4 seasons in one day. So it can rain on any given day. So rain is part of this everyday life. So I often take a lot of pictures of rain going between places or just from home. So I have sort of an archive of these. And for me, it's actually really interesting how they all still look a little bit different. Blue hour, the images on the right are images I took in Senegal when I was traveling through Senegal and the Gambia for a project in 2006. The top image again illustrates this idea of blue hour, but it also shows reflection and silhouette. You're looking at this really beautiful blue light. I'm looking at somebody who's setting up his boat in a lake. So the blue is the blue of the lake, but it's also the quality of the light at this time of day. Um, Sorry, let me address this. So 62% of you felt that emotion is the most important element of visual storytelling. 50% of you felt it was story, and 7% of you thought it was technical. I will say that there is no right or wrong answer to this, but I am of the school of thought that it's between emotion and story as well. So it's not about a right or wrong answer, but we're definitely heading on the right track here. So thank you again for engaging. The image at the end, should I just share results maybe and just put this down? The image again at the top right shows reflection. You're seeing another boat, and the shadow of that boat is reflected on the surface of the water. And on the right, you see the silhouetted figure of the man. So it's an image that sort of shows three aspects of light in one. The image at the bottom, taken during golden hour, again, this really, really beautiful quality of light. You're seeing the shadow of two figures cast along a wall. You're seeing a little bit of light on the face of the man. I haven't done anything exceptional in either of these images. I'm just using a Canon camera, and all I'm doing here is seeing. I'm seeing something that has appealed to me. It looks visually interesting to me, and I've captured it, and that's all I've done. So every single one of you is capable of taking images that can express all of these different things. Talking again here about emotive photographs. I addressed this a little bit at the beginning when I asked you, when I was trying to describe emotive photography. Basically it's a photograph produced or directed to induce emotion. I would even adjust that. I would adjust what I've said here to induce emotion, because by the idea of inducing, you're really saying that the intention of the photographer at the time was to make you feel something. I think that's not necessarily the case. It's just about capturing an image that evokes a particular emotion that you felt as a person, as an individual, while you were taking that photograph. So it really begins with you. How do you feel at that point? Are you happy while you're taking this photograph? Do you feel upset? Do you feel empathy towards the person you're photographing? Do you feel passion towards the landscape you're standing in front of? Because it's a landscape that you grew up with. You went there with your parents, and your parents are no longer there, maybe. So now you're experiencing it from a place of memory. How do you capture that? How do you bring that loaded emotion into a photograph? It's something that we can try to break down, but it all really begins with you and how you channel these emotions into the photograph. So again, emotions, we're talking about joy, melancholy, fear, solitude, anguish, hope, and anxiety, serenity. These are things that are very easy to show in a way, because we kind of know what these things look like. But how do you again articulate them in an image where you're not showing somebody's face, where you're only photographing a landscape, or you're photographing a room? How do you do that? So again, it can be implied in the aesthetics that you choose. You can imply emotion in your use of light, in your use of color or lack of color, if it's black or white, your composition, and certainly in your exposure settings. So this is where understanding your tool, where you're taking a picture, is very important. It's really important to use a tool that you understand how to set the lights on it, how to adjust when the light is too much, and how to create a shadow. So basically understanding the technicals of how your camera works is really important. Here's just an example of some images that I've selected as emotive images. And here's what's really interesting about emotive images. Like all photography, we all may have different opinions to this. So you may look at the image on the bottom right with the reflected figure in the water, and it may actually not really resonate with you. Like it may not make you feel very much. This is because with all photography, again, it resonates with all of us in very different ways. And this is again about the power of photography and the power of storytelling, and the power of your audience as well. We all understand emotion as humans. It's something that we all have, we share, but we all react to different things in very different ways. But in selecting these images, I was really looking at light, at reflection, at movement in an image, like the image on the top left. Movement is a very powerful way to capture emotion because you're suggesting energy. There's energy when you show movement in an image. So that's a way of showing emotion in a still photograph, which could be quite powerful. Use of light in the portrait on the top right. This is a portrait of a widow of one of the farmers who committed suicide in India. So I really wanted to show sort of this the 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 emotion behind, you know, again, the idea of suicide is something that could be quite abstract. If you haven't been touched by it somehow or know somebody that has, how do you put a face on it? So it was very important for me to put a face on it and to show also all the complexity of the series and the project in it. And then the image at the bottom was just the one that it's an image that I actually personally love. And it's an image that I took in one of my favorite places in Cairo. It's a park, a big park called the Al-Azhar Park that overlooks all of Cairo. So I always go there with all these loaded feelings that I have about the place and the country and the city and where I fit in the city. So I always, you know, kind of take pictures there that are loaded with these feelings. Composition, again, is one that we talked about. Composition, you know, think about a painter and a canvas. This is exactly what you're doing as a photographer. You're painting again a canvas with your camera. So how do you express and use every single part of that canvas in a way that is expressive but also useful, a way that has information? So this is exactly what you should try to think of when you're taking a photograph. Don't think about, you know, too much post-production tools. I know they're there and they're there to help us all, but with my workshop today, I really want you to leave feeling that you have the power of authorship as a visual person, that you're not just somebody that's taking photographs, you're an author, you're a decision maker, you're a thinker, that before you take a photograph, you're thinking about the meaning of the photograph, what you're trying to say. So I would really love that to stay with you today. One of the, you know, hopefully the 50% of you, hopefully, if not all of you, the 50% can leave with that today. So think while you capture what you want. Don't rely on post-production. Again, you know, this is debatable, but for me, from my school of thought, I would just say try to capture it as close as possible to what you want it to look at. And then let's look very quickly at the 10 rules of composition. Filling the frame is one that I've already talked about. Make sure that there's information in every part of the frame and information that's useful to what you're trying to say. Avoid cutting off body parts. Again, you know, maybe you just want to take a picture of somebody's hands. Maybe somebody hasn't allowed you to take a picture showing their face, so you just want to take a picture of their upper body. So these are all decisions that you have to take. Part of what we do as photographers is that we're constantly challenged. We have to problem solve all the time. We can be in situations where the light is bad, where we don't have, where we're not allowed to photograph a certain person, and then we have to figure out a way of telling the story differently. So you're constantly thinking and trying to solve problems. The rule of thirds. Again, I don't want the terminology, it's just called the rule of thirds, but I don't want you to think that it's a rule that you have to follow. I actually believe rules are there to be broken. Of course, it depends on what rules, so I don't want to cause problems here, but at least within photography, rules are made to be broken is my solid belief. So don't really think that the rule of thirds means this is what you have to do. It's just basically saying that one technique of taking a picture is where you put something in 1/3 of the frame and leave the rest with something else. And I'll show you an example of that. And then using framing elements, like maybe there's an archway in part of a picture, so maybe you can use that to frame somebody that you're photographing. Maybe there's a lot of lines, like maybe you've seen online some of these pictures with people crossing a crosswalk in Tokyo with all of these lines, and then there's a massive people crossing. So again, this is about using the lines on the street to create something that's quite visual and interesting. And this is just some examples of that. So the rule of thirds is one that I'm illustrating here. So on the image on the top right, you see the woman is on the left part of the frame, and then the rest of the frame, so 2/3 of it, are basically occupied by this red hibiscus flower. So this is a way of showing thirds. By the same token, um, sorry, I'm just going to minimize this for now. By the same token, the image at the bottom shows the rule of thirds, you know, the girl on the swing, the rest is the lawn and just basically the swings. So it's another way of creating this emptiness, creating a sense of solitude, it evokes so many different meanings. And filling the frame, like the image at the top that you're seeing, where you're looking at the landscape of Cairo at the bottom, some of the laundry of my family's laundry hanging in the distance, and there's a sandstorm. So again, there's this idea of the drama in the image, and you're filling the frame with all of these different things. Using lines and shapes, again, we've kind of addressed it a little bit. Keeping it simple, I would always say try to keep it simple. A lot of times I feel that when I personally try to overthink things, I get stuck in my head a little bit, and then I try to break it down and peel the layers and get back to the core of what I'm trying to do. So try to keep your composition simple, try to then maybe add complexity to them, but just try to keep things as simple as they can be. Watching your background. So make sure that the background isn't too busy. There isn't a light pole running through somebody's head, because it then looks like it's growing out of their head, or a tree is growing out from their head. So watch out, try to, you know, all it takes sometimes is maybe to just take one step down and look up, and then you can capture them against the blue sky or maybe against something else, and create a depth by layering things. So the image at the bottom is a good example of that. It's an image I took in Thailand. And basically this has the elements of foreground, middle ground, and background. So I've layered in a way where you're filling the frame, but there's also, it creates a depth. So your eyes are kind of going through deeper layers in the image as a viewer. And the top is just a 2-layer picture. You're seeing sort of these textures on the window. It's a dirty window. So you're seeing that on the front, and then you're seeing the silhouette of the landscape in the back. And again, simplicity, the image on the top right, all this that's happening there is there's this very interesting light at night, and I'm basically looking from the top, and it's really the people and what's naturally there that has given sort of this interesting composition to the image.
Hi, Laura. I'm just going to jump in here. We've been, you're doing an amazing job, and the questions that have been coming in are fantastic. And I think let's stop the workshop there and just answer a couple of them, because some of them are really specific to you. And I think it's about, the biggest one is about cultural dynamics. How do you manage to deal with that when you're in a different country and you have different cultures, because you photograph all over the place? If you could talk a little bit about that in our last minute.
Sure. Well, that's a really good question. And basically, cultural dynamics, I think always reading and understanding a culture before you travel to it is absolutely key. Talk to people maybe from there and try to get an understanding of what things can upset people, but what things also make, you know, don't upset people, basically make them happy. Learn a few words from the local language that you're going, basically how to say hello, how are you, just certain things. I find that this always warms people up because it makes them feel like you've made a little bit of an effort to understand them. One thing that went a long way for me in India was when I just did this at the end and I told people namaste at the beginning and end. People were absolutely delighted by that. And I don't know, it just showed a little bit of respect maybe. But I think understanding boundaries, gestures, how to dress in a particular culture, if maybe that's something you need to be aware of. You know, as a woman also, this is something that I have to think about as well. So how do I present myself? Are there certain things that maybe in a particular culture are not acceptable for me to do? Is it something I have to be aware of? So 2 big tips: learn a few words from the language and how to interact with people. Learn about cultural boundaries. What can I do? What can I not do? Don't disrespect people. If you're working with somebody from there, always listen to what they're telling you, and don't try to be stubborn or go against what people are telling you, because then you're gonna basically burn bridges and you're gonna disrespect people. And that's not really what photography is about. It's about navigating the world, understanding it, and telling stories that show and this greater understanding.
Brilliant. That's really insightful. I think the other question that's coming through is when you're in a situation, let's say it's there's a bit of civil unrest, maybe, or protests, and some of your imagery captures protests really beautifully. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with those moments? And how do you get in there and stay safe and still take amazing pictures?
Well, I think it's really important to know what your comfort level is. So I'm not somebody that would ever go to the front lines of something. So, in Egypt, when we had the protests, I was never somebody that went to the very front where the really hard confrontations were happening. I was always sort of in the back with people, and I never really tried to push myself beyond my comfort level, because I didn't want to do that. I think it's always important to surround yourself with people. So even though I mostly went out on my own, I always talked to people. I told them who I was. I had conversations with them, so that if something happened and things got out of control, we would at least have an eye on each other. I would know them, they would know me. I find that instinct is very important in this case. I always really use my instinct to guide me through these really tricky situations. Do I feel comfortable? Do I not feel comfortable? Do I trust this person? Do I get a negative vibe, a positive vibe? I really, really trust my instinct. Of course, this is easier to navigate when I understand the language. If I don't understand the language, I would always be working with a translator, a partner in this case, that would help me understand these things and be able to navigate them.
Fantastic. We have, there's another question. We've been extended for 5 minutes, so we have 2 more minutes. So one quick answer to a question, then I think we'd probably better say thank you to everybody and goodbye. I've got a quick, what about the audiences? So the audiences between East and West, do you shoot for different audiences, or do you shoot for everybody?
For me personally, I shoot for everybody. I feel like my work again is stemming from my own personal experience as somebody that through my own journey, I've navigated 2 cultures, the UK, so basically Europe and the US, and Egypt and the Middle East. So for me, I'm naturally addressing these 2 audiences and showing my relationship to the world, my own sense of identity, and how that comes in visually. So I think it's important to know your audience always. But for me, my work again stems from emotion, and I really feel like people react to emotions. So in that sense, I don't shelter one audience from the work. It's available for everybody.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to wrap up in our last minute. Thank you very much, Laura, for all of that. And I believe that the presentation and the film will be available afterwards through the Festival of Action website. I wanted to say thank you for joining us. The questions are amazing. I actually couldn't keep up. It was just me, and I was typing as fast as I possibly could. There are lots of good questions. Hopefully we'll get the chance to come back to some of you, perhaps. But really, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Laura. Is there any closing words you'd just like to say?
No, thank you so much for having me. I mean, I'm absolutely delighted to be here on this platform. I'm so delighted to be speaking to the audience, and I've just put my contacts online. If you need questions or anything that I can help you with, I'm always there to help if I can. So thank you so much for tuning in today.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We're not live, are we?
I think
Just stopped it in that moment.
I couldn't keep up with the question. The question was really deep, and I was